All right. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Laura Shane, and I recently joined Freedom House as the Vice President of Communications. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all today, and thank you for joining us in what has been such a busy and shocking week. I would just like to say that I know many of you guys are our partners, and we collaborate with you, and I just look forward to working with you for the weeks and months and years ahead. So it's very nice to make your acquaintance. I think it's especially timely that we're launched this report this week as we see everything kind of unfolding on the world stage. And so today you're going to get a chance to hear from Freedom House President Michael Abramowitz, who's going to put this in larger context. The report's findings were soberingly prescient, and he's going to put this in the broader context for you all in the larger landscape of freedom and democracy. And then you'll get a chance to hear from two of the amazing researchers who led the team that is Freedom of the World 2022. And so they will give you a presentation of what's new this year, and then we will be able to take some of your questions, and you'll be able to drop those right in the Q&A. So with that, it is my great pleasure to turn it over to Freedom House President Mike Abramowitz.
Thank you, Lara. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm very honored that all of you have chosen to spend some time with us this morning on a really important subject. It's really a great privilege for me to run an organization like Freedom House. We're now in our 80th year, and the last few weeks have really driven home, I think, how vital our mission is. We've been reporting on the state of freedom in the world for almost 50 years. We're actually going to celebrate the 50th anniversary of freedom in the world next year. And this is a really important flagship publication for Freedom House, but it's only part of what we do. We, in addition to reporting and informing on the state of democracy in the world, we also advocate for policy changes. And we also, one of the pieces of Freedom House that I'm really proud of is our support for frontline defenders and journalists and activists all over the world who are fighting for freedom in their own countries. Today's briefing, we're going to focus on the really disturbing trends that took place in 2021 with regard to democracy. But let me just say that the events of this week really drive home to me and to many others, I think, just how important this issue is and how timely this report is. Yesterday, a powerful authoritarian leader with no provocation decided to declare war on an embattled democracy, a struggling democracy, but a democracy nonetheless, in clear defiance of the country's own wishes about how it wants to be governed. This is a country where the Ukrainian people for the last 30 years have made clear that they want to be independent and they want to live in a democracy. And he did so, he ordered an invasion in total defiance of those wishes as well as international law. And he is a despot and a killer and a thug, and we roundly condemn what he did. But I think the thing that's concerning is that this is just but one example of a growing authoritarian trend that we are seeing around the world. I really think the world's democracies need to wake up to what is happening in the world. Freedom in the world, you'll hear from Amy and Sarah shortly, but the findings this year are really disturbing. For the 16th consecutive year, political rights and civil liberties, the respect of political rights and civil liberties have been declining. Only 25 countries had an improvement in those scores. Less than half of how many had declines. A number that really pops out for me is that only 1 in 5 people in the world now live in a country that Freedom House considers free, fully free, and that is really disturbing. We will welcome your questions, but I think I'm just going to stop there and turn it over to Sarah and Amy to walk us through the findings, and the three of us will be then happy to answer any questions afterwards. That will if you have questions, you should put them, I guess, Lara, in the chat function, right? And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can within the hour. So Sarah and Amy, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Mike. And I think we'll put the questions in the Q&A function, please. So before we dive in, I want to give you some background on the report. Freedom in the World assesses political rights and civil liberties in 210 countries and territories each calendar year. What we're doing is evaluating the state of freedom as experienced by people within specific country or territorial borders. We're not rating government performance. We focus on the real world rights and freedoms as experienced by individuals, regardless of whether that impact is coming from state or non-state or domestic or foreign actors. We assess countries by assigning scores on a 100-point scale. So when you see scores in this presentation, they're on a 100-point scale. Based on that, we divide the world into free, partly free, and not free countries. Here you can see the green countries are free, the yellow countries are partly free, and the purple countries are not free.
So based on that analysis, Freedom in the World 2022 finds that global freedom faces a dire threat. In 2021, freedom declined for the 16th consecutive year. As you can see on this chart, 60 countries suffered declines in freedom and democracy over the past year. Only 25 countries improved, and this is the fewest number of net improvements since the decline began. This small number of improvements is a sign that the decline is not reversing and is in fact deepening. The main driver of the decline in 2021 was that autocrats are increasingly cooperating and supporting each other in their attacks on democratic norms and institutions. Authoritarians have made enormous gains in the international system, and they're using that influence to promote autocracy as a viable alternative to democracy. This cooperation isn't based on any unifying ideology or affinity or friendship among authoritarians. Rather, it's based on a single shared interest, which is to stay in power by any means necessary. Democracies do continue to respond to authoritarian abuses, and they do this with measures like sanctions and withholding aid. But their impact is diminished by growing economic and political support among authoritarians.
This has real world consequences for the majority of people across the globe. 8 in 10 people around the world now live in a partly free or not free country. That's 80% of the population living in a country that does not provide for full political rights and protect fundamental freedoms.
So 5 countries crossed the line between free, partly free, and not free in 2021. I'll start with the positive side, which is that Ecuador and Peru both improved from partly free to free. We'll go into Ecuador in just a bit. As you can see on this chart, though, more status changes were declines. Tunisia dropped from free to partly free, while Guinea and Haiti both fell from partly free to not free. I'll highlight Tunisia, which is especially troubling. It was the only country that was part of the Arab Spring that went on to achieve a status of free. And it made significant strides to establish democratic institutions over the years. It gained 48 points on our scale between 2010 and 2020. That was the largest improvement of any country during that period. Tunisia dropped to partly free this year, though, after President Said unilaterally dismissed the prime minister and indefinitely suspended parliament last July to rule by decree. Tunisia really shows that democracy is not an endpoint. It does take constant work. So countries like Tunisia that are at an inflection point need long-term support to maintain and build on previous gains.
This slide shows the countries that had the largest gains and the largest declines in 2021. As you can see, the gains are much smaller than the declines, and there's many fewer of them, which is another sign of the depth of the recession. Myanmar saw the largest drop this year. It had a total of 19 points in decline. This is really a huge plunge, and it was the result of the 2021 coup and its aftermath. Myanmar had been a success case not that long ago. It had a political opening that started in 2011. That has been completely reversed. Under the military regime, authorities have arrested political leaders en masse. Security forces have killed over 1,000 people while cracking down on pro-democracy protests, and many others have faced torture while in jail. Afghanistan also had a massive decline. It fell by 17 points since the US withdrawal. The Taliban eliminated representative rule. It demolished the constitutional rights of women and ethnic and religious minority groups, and it has persecuted human rights defenders and independent journalists, among many other grave violations of individual rights and liberties. Among the gains, I want to highlight Ecuador, which is a genuine bright spot in our findings. Ecuador improved by 4 points in 2021. This was a continuation of steady progress that the country has made over the past 5 years. Former President Moreno had supported numerous reforms, including a new process to appoint more independent judges, and he reduced state control over the media and pardoned human rights activists. Elections in 2021 led to a peaceful transfer of power to an opposition candidate. And all of this has helped lead to the status change in Ecuador from partly free to free.
I'm going to delve into Ukraine since, of course, that is all on our minds today. In 2021, Ukraine was a partly free country. It is a struggling but aspiring democracy. And though issues like endemic corruption remained, Ukrainians were largely free to exercise their political choices. I'll note that we assess Crimea and Eastern Donbass as separate territories. This is consistent with our methodology, where we assess territories separately when conditions on the ground for political rights and civil liberties are significantly different from those in the rest of the country. So in our assessments, Crimea scores only 7 on our 100-point scale, and Eastern Donbass is even lower at 4. Both are not free. Russian occupation in Crimea and Eastern Donbass severely constrains people's rights and freedom there, putting them among the worst scoring places in the world. Putin's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine threatens to plunge the country to the levels of Crimea and Eastern Donbass and erase Ukrainian freedom. The safety, security, and fundamental rights of 43 million Ukrainians is in serious jeopardy.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine is just the latest example of the expansion of authoritarianism that is driving the democratic decline. A major cause of this expansion is that authoritarian leaders are increasingly collaborating with one another to spread new forms of repression and rebuff democratic pressure. I'll give you an example from last year. After the military coups that took place in both Myanmar and then in Sudan, Chinese and Russian envoys worked to water down the UN Security Council's response. The Kremlin has also continued to prop up Alexander Lukashenko's dictatorship in Belarus, and that country in turn has provided a launching base for Russian troops invading Ukraine. Another form of cooperation is transnational repression. Autocratic regimes have cooperated when they strive to silence their own dissidents in exile. They do this through rendition, Interpol abuse, coercion by proxy, and digital surveillance, among other tactics. Collaboration among autocrats is not new. What is new is the effects that this collaboration is having on the ground in countries around the world.
So here you can see some of those effects. We have coups, elections with predetermined outcomes, and power grabs. Military coups were more common in 2021 than in any year of the past decade. Last year, to take one example, Mali had its second coup in just 10 months. And while the slide only reflects 2021, already this year, the military has seized control in Burkina Faso. No contest elections are also spreading, as you can see here. In countries from Russia to Nicaragua, authoritarian leaders have dropped even the pretense of competitive elections. They've jailed the opposition outright and are congratulating each other on their undemocratic wins. Countries that have struggled in the space between democracy and authoritarianism have begun tilting in a less free direction. The reason for this is that established authoritarians are offering an alternative source of external support and investment for their less established peers. So previously developing and transitioning countries might have been pressured to enact democratic reforms if they wanted to gain support from the wider international community. But today they have the option of things like economic support through the Belt and Road Initiative, or authoritarian political support at the UN, and so on.
At the same time, established democracies are being weakened from within by domestic illiberal forces. Here you can see some of the democratic institutions that are being targeted by elected leaders or political parties inside democracies. On electoral process, the most striking example last year was arguably in the United States, when rioters on January 6th attempted to overturn the election results. But another prominent example is Brazil, where President Bolsonaro is up for re-election in October. He has been laying the groundwork in advance in case he doesn't like the result and chooses to claim fraud. One of his tactics has been to groundlessly cast doubt on electronic voting machines that will be used. Rule of law is another pillar of democracy that is under threat. For example, in Poland, the governing Law and Justice Party has been doggedly manipulating and circumventing the law over the past years in order to assert control over the judiciary. In 2021, this included a ruling by the Constitutional Tribunal that some parts of EU law are incompatible with Polish law. This seems to pave the way for the party to further demolish previously accepted democratic norms and laws. A third challenge is discrimination and mistreatment of migrants. We saw this in Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania last year when migrants and asylum seekers were crossing the border from Belarus. Those democratic governments chose to push these individuals back into Belarus in violation of both EU and international law. And finally, media freedom. For much of 2021, the government of Slovenia, as an example, withheld legally mandated funds intended for the country's public broadcaster, despite a judicial ruling to restore the funding.
I'm going to talk a bit more about the United States' scores, since I imagine that may be of interest to many people here. I'll also note that we have a separate short essay on the US this year, and that's included on our website with the other report materials. The United States is a free country, but the democracy has been deteriorating. And this has happened during both Republican and Democratic administrations. This year, the US score did stay steady. It had gains in free association and governmental transparency, but these were offset by losses stemming from the rise in political violence and threats, and also a decline in academic freedom. That latter decline in academic freedom is a sign of growing illiberalism in the public square that we've been seeing. On this graphic, you can see the US scores for some key indicators of concern. Each indicator is scored out of 4 points. So as you can see, the US falls below many other democracies in these areas. Freedom in the United States is challenged by serious systemic issues. They include inadequate protection against discrimination, which affects people of color in many parts of society, and years of increasing political polarization. The United States does have great influence on the global stage. Democracy's advocates and its detractors observe what happens in the country very closely, and its ability to advance democratic values and interests in the world really depends on its success in addressing its own democratic shortcomings.
We must not take the freedoms that we enjoy for granted. Established and aspiring autocrats are working together to consolidate and expand their power. They're not going to stop unless champions of democracy stand together and make them. Here you can see some of the examples of places where people are risking their lives to demand freedom, from Myanmar to Cuba to Sudan, and today in Ukraine. Despite crackdowns and pushback, we expect the demand for democracy to continue because people have an inherent desire to live freely. These people need support. Global collaboration is the only way to reverse the democratic decline and enable people to secure and protect their fundamental rights.
The report also includes detailed policy recommendations on things we think can be done to reverse this long-term decline. There is no silver bullet, but this gives you some of our ideas. We divide the recommendations into 3 categories. The first is how to nurture democracy globally. Second, how to counter authoritarianism. And third, how to strengthen democracy at home. Shows of solidarity like President Biden's Summit for Democracy this past December are a good first step. But democratic governments need to move beyond rhetoric to decisive action. So this includes meaningful support for local pro-democracy movements, targeted sanctions against autocrats, and investing in civic education at home. You can find our more detailed recommendations in the report. So we'll now turn to your questions. We're happy to dive more deeply into what we've already discussed or cover other topics as well. Just before we do that though, we're going to drop a survey link into the chat. We're hoping to better understand Freedom in the World's impact and have developed a survey that should take you no more than 3 minutes to fill out. So we would be grateful if you could click on the link and do that.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Sarah, for an excellent presentation. And let me just say also thank you. I'm not sure that people on this call really understand the amount of work that goes into Freedom in the World. Dozens of Freedom House staff are involved in the production of this report, as well as hundreds of experts and consultants from around the world. It's really a process, I think, Sarah, that probably takes about 6 months to, I'm guessing, to put together, if not longer. And we take very seriously, making sure that the methodology, which has really essentially been in place for almost 50 years, is respected and rigorously followed. So thank you for that great work, Sarah and Amy. So I made a mistake. I said put your questions in the chat. I actually meant people should put their questions in the Q&A, and I'm already seeing some good questions, which I will launch in on. And then, if you have more questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. And I'm just going to go to the first question, maybe for Sarah, which is, kind of relates in some ways to our other big area of interest, which is tech and democracy and freedom of the net, which is another report we do. But how do you think technological challenges to privacy and censorship of free speech and the amplification of misinformation and hate speech will impact the freedoms of long-established democracies in the 21st century?
Yeah, it's a great question. We've definitely seen a big impact from technology. In this particular report, we don't separate out the impact of technology from other impacts, but we have individual examples of how we've seen changes in freedom because of the rise of disinformation and the increasing self-censorship, particularly on the internet. I think that this will continue. I don't think that we've seen the peak of misinformation. It's a very challenging problem to address, and it requires a multifaceted approach from a lot of different angles. I think that people, to some extent, are becoming more savvy about it, but also the technology is becoming more advanced at the same time, and that makes it much more challenging. I think we are also seeing a rise, especially inside democracies, of a more extremist kind of rhetoric that is frequently against certain groups in society, and frequently minority groups or other disadvantaged groups. These groups are scapegoated in many societies. And one of the troubling things that we see is that a lot of autocratic techniques are tried out on these populations first, because they are the most vulnerable, and they're the ones who have the fewest people to stand up for them. And those techniques often spread into other parts of society later on. So these are developments that we have been watching very closely, and I do not think that we've seen the end of their impact on global freedom.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, this is a question that's specific to Southeast Asia, but I think it could have broader implications. This is from Hansley Juliana, who identifies as a Filipino, and she asks, or I'm sorry, I don't mean to presume gender there, but do you find that international and regional bodies are becoming more and more compromised, unable to influence or pressure Southeast Asian countries, especially when nearly all the political elites of these countries have zero interest in giving democratic concessions, and nearly all the SEA countries are held hostage by Chinese economic hegemony? Let me just, if I may make, Sarah, just 2 points here, and maybe you might want to add something. I think in general, one major theme of the report this year that I found really important was the growing influence of China and other authoritarian states on the international scene, specifically in international and regional bodies. You know, one body that comes to mind is the Human Rights Council in Geneva. And there was an interesting statistic in the report this year about the 50 or so countries that are on the UN Human Rights Council. Only one third essentially are free countries, another third are partly free countries, and another third are not free countries. That's basically the proportion, the exact numbers you can look up on the report. And so that means when the Human Rights Council is going to sit in judgment next week, or hopefully, on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's going to be seriously compromised. So I think the gist of your question is very well appreciated. I wonder, Sarah or Amy, if you'd want to add anything else from the report that might sustain what I just said.
Yeah, I think as we saw with the response to the military coup from ASEAN, it was pretty limited, and there wasn't really any mechanism to hold the military junta accountable. But I kind of want to flip that and talk about some of the coups in West Africa and ECOWAS's response to those. ECOWAS has really responded rather forcefully to some of those coups. And I think it can be a great example of how regional bodies can work to kind of hold their member countries accountable when they commit democratic or human rights violations, and kind of a way to get around what we're seeing in bodies like the Human Rights Council and the Security Council.
Great, thank you very much. There's a question in here about Rwanda, which I'm going to not read the whole question, but the gist of the question is some concern that Freedom House has not, I guess that Rwanda is not doing poorly in our scores, which actually I would suggest is not the case. Sarah and Amy can speak to the specific score, which I believe it's a not free country, and you can give the specific number. I don't think there's been, I think one of the reasons you don't see anything in the report this year, or much about the report about Rwanda, is that there wasn't any major changes in Rwanda. But I would also say, I would draw listeners' attention to a report we did last year concerning a really concerning practice that we call transnational repression, which is the increasing propensity of authoritarian states to really try to intimidate, and in some cases even kill, their political opponents who have gone into the diaspora. And that report put a spotlight on Rwanda as one of 6 countries that were serious violators of this norm. So is there anything else specifically about Rwanda that Amy and Sarah, you want to add?
No, I would just add that it's fallen by around 12 points over the last decade or so. So we have marked a significant decline in the country. And often when a country has fallen by so much, there's not really any room for it to fall further. So I think the not free status and its current score, which I think is only 21, shows the depths of the repression in the country.
Thank you. Okay, here's a question from Jonathan Isaacson, which I ask Sarah all the time, so maybe you can try it out for the group here. Why are things getting so much worse from a democracy freedom perspective now? What's driving this?
Yeah, so I mean, certainly I'd say that the drivers are complex. There's not just one, and it has evolved over the 16 years that we've been observing the decline. At the beginning of the decline, we were seeing a lot of authoritarian regimes that were finding new ways to repress their populations. So we were seeing bad countries getting worse, and innovative forms of repression that we hadn't seen before. That has continued. But in addition to that, we then started to see more free countries falling back, and some of those declines from within democracies that we were noting earlier in the presentation. Most recently, I would really emphasize this point about cooperation. The authoritarian cooperation that we are seeing and that we have been seeing for years is bearing fruit in on-the-ground results in terms of countries being able to turn to other fellow autocrats. Governments are able to turn to those fellow autocrats in order to get support that they used to need other democracies for. Just after the Cold War, democracies would provide aid and other forms of economic support and trade to countries that were willing to buy in to this democratic model. And today there are these authoritarian alternatives that enable the decline to continue and have brought us to the point where it no longer looks like we can just target a few declining countries and turn them around, but that we really need a wholesale democratic coalition to make a change.
Thank you, Sarah. All right, now we're getting to have a lot of questions here and about 25 minutes left, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. Let me just think for a second. Here's a question from, I think this is an interesting element of the US report this year, and Amy touched on this. This is from David Shanzer from Duke. In assessing academic freedom in the US, do you consider the role that China is playing in terms of Confucius Institute's dependency of US universities on full paying students from China and joint ventures between US universities and China?
We've definitely been watching this development in terms of Confucius Institutes and pressure within universities for professors to speak in a certain way about China, or for students to report on what they hear if they hear anti-CCP language in their universities. This is a developing issue in the United States. On our rather blunt 4-point scale, it was not a dominant factor in our change in academic freedom, but it is a point that we are watching as part of what I would say is a broader focus that we have on the different ways that the Chinese Communist Party is having influence within all types of countries, including democracies around the world, both in universities, but also in the media environment. And we have other projects that focus on this, and I would call your attention to an upcoming report we will have next fall on the influence of the Chinese Communist Party in the media environment around the world.
Thank you, Sarah. Let's stay on China for a minute. Here's a question from Tenzin from Radio Free Asia. Did the Beijing Winter Olympics have any influence on the overall deterioration of freedom in China? I mean, I think, to be honest, the Winter Olympics took place in 2022, and so would not have any impact on the scores in 2021. But I do think, in general, and maybe Amy and Sarah would want to elaborate on this, I think the Olympics did show it did reveal to the world elements of the Chinese repressive apparatus that has been, identified in Freedom House reports over the last number of years, and others. I think I just saw a story today about how there was concern about foreign reporters being tailed and followed by the authorities in China. I wonder, Sarah or Amy, if you have a thought just on this question.
I think that the Olympics actually were an opportunity to have quite a lot of focus on the human rights situation in China, and especially in Xinjiang province and against the Uyghur population. We are encouraged by the attention that this issue has been gaining, and we hope that that momentum will continue, because this really is a terrible situation. And one that we think that both private companies and other governments and individuals need to pay more attention to.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Okay, let me just think for a second. Actually, okay, let's just stay on one more question on China, because I always want to talk about Tibet. So Amy, can you give us a little bit of update on Tibet? It always does poorly in our scores. There's a question here that one of the watchers wants to answer. Can you answer that? Give us an update on Tibet.
Yeah, Tibet, its score didn't change this year. It remains very low. We look at it as a separate territory, and it's among one of the lowest countries and territories in the world. So unfortunately, not much movement on that this year.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's move around the world. And here's a question, and Amy, I'm going to stick on you for a minute. There's a question about Turkey and Syria. Obviously, Syria, I think, is probably one of the 3 least free countries in the world, according to our scores. But how is Turkey doing under President Erdogan?
Yeah, Turkey, it didn't change in its scores this year, but it has fallen by a huge amount of points over the last 10 years. It was really precipitated by the 2016 coup attempt and Erdogan's subsequent crackdown on basically all sectors of political rights and civil liberties in the country. So we're seeing that continue, and yeah, it has one of the largest long-term score declines by our measures.
Okay, thank you. All right, here's just one methodological question. I think maybe one of you could answer this. The question is, do you tweak rankings throughout the year? For example, the Philippines are due to have an election in May in which the current president does not appear to be standing. Will that have an impact on that ranking?
So we assess countries just once and look at them throughout the entire calendar year. So at the end of the year, we'll take a look at what happened in the elections in the Philippines, and we'll decide whether any score changes are warranted.
Okay, thank you. There's a question about India. Do you think India is still one of the great, or don't you think India is still one of the great democracies, considering last year's long farmer protests, relative free press, and also free and fair election? Don't you think India should score much better in the freedom score? I thank you, sir, for that question. I think India was actually a bigger story last year, because India had a very substantial deterioration in the freedom score and actually crossed from being a free country in the Freedom House rankings to being a partly free country. And from a global perspective, I think that was one of the most concerning stories, I think, of democracy in the last few years. I do think that I agree with the premise of your question, which is that I think most independent analysts, do consider the Indian election to be free and fair, but our scores don't only reflect elections; they look at other factors. And maybe I'm hoping that Sarah and Amy one of you could discuss, why India has done relatively poorly in our scores over the last several years, and why we're concerned about India.
Yeah, I can go ahead, and Sarah, feel free to add to it. Where we're seeing declines is really concentrated on the civil liberties side of things. So we've seen particularly pressure on academic freedom, on independent journalists, on civil society, with many civil society organizations being deregistered. But then also we're quite concerned with the political rights side, where there are laws being passed in the past few years that discriminate against certain segments of the population and really take away some of their political rights. And we've seen that continue this past year. India had opposition politicians facing targeted investigations, arrest, and surveillance at the hands of the BJP. So we do see a continuing backslide in the country.
Okay, thank you, Amy. Sarah, do you want to add anything? Okay, all right. Let's turn to a different subject, which I'm glad George Sibley asked, which is about COVID-19. We've read about autocratic leaders using the pandemic as an opportunity or excuse to restrict speech, assembly, other freedoms in the name of public health. Are these kinds of policies enacted, or are these kinds of policies captured in our report? And do you expect that this restrictive grip might weaken as the pandemic becomes, you know, as the questioner says, more endemic? So that's a good question, and would really appreciate Sarah and Amy to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, we do incorporate government responses to COVID-19 into our methodology. So it can touch so many facets of a country's institutions, everything from transparency to corruption to disproportionate restrictions on assembly and movement. And what we saw in 2021 was that the pandemic did continue to exacerbate the democratic decline. So just to give a few examples of ways this occurred, one was in Malaysia. The government initiated a state of emergency, which led to a 7-month suspension of parliament. Government officials in Cameroon embezzled funds allocated to combat the pandemic. And then in Zambia, authorities disproportionately used COVID restrictions to clamp down on opposition gatherings. So these are just a few ways that this is being done. And I think even if COVID-19 becomes more endemic, there's always going to be some new form of emergency, whether a public health crisis or climate change or any type of emergency that governments can seize upon if they want to and restrict dissent and consolidate power.
Thank you. There are a number of questions in the chat or in the Q&A kind of about policy, if I may. There's just a simple question here about, hold on for 1 second, I'm just looking through the questions. Well, there's a question here about the limited effects of targeted sanctions. What do we think about that? There's a question just in generally about, like, when you say that democracy should collaborate and stand together, what policies or actions should that entail? Let me just sort of take a crack at some of the policy answers. I think the first point I would say is that there is no silver bullet. I think we at Freedom House worked with the McCain Institute and CSIS, a Washington think tank, last year on kind of a whole of government strategy to address democratic erosion and decline. And there were dozens of recommendations in there. And I think one point is there's not one magic bullet. I think we do believe at Freedom House that targeted sanctions can be effective. I think we've actually had a relatively limited amount of time experimenting with this. The Global Magnitsky Act is still relatively new. And I think the idea of targeting individual human rights violators and those engaging in corrupt practices, putting them on visa bans, putting them, limiting their access to Western finance. I think we do believe that that has a great deal of promise as a tool for the protection of human rights. I think in general, we also think there's a lot of room to act with respect to the growing corruption that has been identified in some of the country reports that the team has put together. And I think you're seeing from the Biden administration a big focus on attacking corruption. I will just say, with respect to Russia in particular, I think there's been a lot of very strong reporting suggesting extensive corruption at the senior levels among Putin himself and around the oligarchs that help prop up the regime. So I think that's another potentially promising avenue for policymakers. And then I would also say the issue of transnational oppression, if I can just beat on that for a minute. We really believe that there is a greater danger to those living in democracies from autocratic governments. We've seen that with respect to China, for instance, the intimidation of Uyghurs who are living in America by threatening their families to get them to shut up. So I think that's another area, I think, of policy reform. But I think, as I said, in general, I think there's no silver bullet there. And I wonder, Sarah, if there's anything, from your experience leading this report over several years, whether you'd want to add any policy recommendations that you think might, flow from the report.
Well, definitely one is to remember that we can't impose democracy from the outside. What we need to do is support and empower the individuals in these countries who know the situation best, know what their country needs, and can carry it through and help consolidate the gains over time. So it is really important to tackle this at different levels. And that includes supporting civil society activists, human rights defenders who are in their countries with the types of support that they need, whether that is technical support, financial support, building connections for them, helping with training, et cetera.
No, thank you for that. Sarah, I'm going to come back to another question on a different front. I'm seeing a question about the US, and it's a question: do you think failing to hold Trump and other electeds responsible for the insurrection is emboldening the anti-democratic forces? And do you worry about the Republican takeover of fair voting? Feel free to answer in any way you see, but can you talk a little bit more about the points that you and Amy were discussing about the US and just, what the trends you see with the US?
Yeah, I mean, we're very concerned about the trend in this country right now. I think that the events of January 6th the effects of it were not isolated to that time. We're continuing to see a long-term impact of an undermining of public faith in our electoral system and a perpetuation of the false and groundless claim that there was fraud in our last elections and that there might be fraud going forward. I also think that the intimidation of election administrators is a very big concern. We're seeing increased threats and intimidation, and an unprecedented number of these election administrators who have resigned in recent weeks and months. And what that will mean for the upcoming midterm elections and the next presidential election is yet to be seen. But it is crucial that, first of all, that Americans understand that our electoral system is actually very secure and fraud is very rare. But also that we have independent administrators who are not beholden to partisan interests and who will make sure that the electoral process goes as it is intended and that the results are properly processed and counted and upheld in the end. So the electoral system is, I think, the part of, or a major part of, where we are focused in terms of the future trajectory of US democracy.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, we have about 8 minutes left, so I'm going to try to get in a few more questions. including a question about hope, but we'll save that for the last question because we want to send you out on a positive sign, on a positive note. But here's a question, Jess. We haven't really talked about Africa, and I think that's important. It's really your general thoughts on the Africa scores. I think actually it's an interesting point. Sudan had an interesting and disturbing story this year. Amy, could you talk a little bit about what you think the key trends in Africa are? And if I could just throw in probably another, Latin America. We haven't really talked too much about Latin America. And I think Latin America also has a really interesting kind of good and bad situation going on there. So maybe, Amy, you could talk a little bit about both continents just briefly.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with Africa. Freedom did decline overall in the region. We saw 22 countries and territories experience an overall decline and only 9 improved. I think one of the big trends that everyone's been noticing is that there have been many military coups on the continent, particularly concentrated in West Africa. West Africa, I'll note, was a pretty stable region, and it was the second best sub-region on the continent. So the deterioration there that we saw this year especially is particularly worrying. And I think it's really important to make sure that the supporters of democracy can shore up these countries and help the people inside who are already trying to do that. To switch over to Latin America, I think that's a really interesting region to pay attention to. There have been a lot of declines in the region over the past few years. So previously it was relatively free and only Cuba was an outlier with not free status. That changed around 5 or 6 years ago when Venezuela became not free and Nicaragua followed after the 2018 crackdown on mass protests. So Nicaragua dropped by 7 points this past year because of the no contest elections that were held. The Ortega regime jailed many opposition figures, arrested presumed opposition candidates on various charges, including anti-terrorism. And there has also been a big crackdown on independent civil society with the 2020 passing of the Foreign Agents Law. At the same time, we saw Ecuador improve to free, and countries, including Peru, made some gains as well. So there is kind of this struggle in Latin America around democracy and whether that will win out.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left, and I'm going to focus the final 5 minutes on hope. There's a question here: where is the hope, if any, a positive possibility for growth, protection of democracy, democratic values, rule of law? Is the future seemingly one-party states that hopefully are not repressive? I'm not going to read the whole question, but you get the drift. Yes, there's big cause for hope. I do not believe this is the end of democracy. I'd like to really ask both Amy and Sarah to comment on this. Sarah touched upon it a little bit in the slide presentation, but let me just say 2 things. Number one is I do think that we are seeing considerable citizen pushback around the world. Sadly, it's being shut down now by authoritarian powers, but I've been very surprised and pleased about the citizen pushback all over the world in places like Myanmar, Sudan, Belarus, a number of other countries. And so I think that gives me hope. And I also think you have to take a long view, and you have to look. There are some countries now that are really thriving democracies that were not so 30 to 40 years ago. You know, I think one country or one area in particular, there's a debate about whether, but is Taiwan. Taiwan is one of the most thriving, democratic success stories right now. And there are a number of other countries in that category that were really dictatorships or to communist countries 30 to 40 years ago. So I do think that gives me cause for hope. Sarah, Amy, why don't we start with Amy, and then Sarah, you can take us out with your hope.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I think when you bring up Taiwan, that's a great point, that there are many democracies that are not as long established as some of the kind of traditional consolidated democracies we tend to look at. So these countries that have made recent gains can be a really good opportunity for backsliding established democracies to take a look and see what others have done in these contexts and perhaps learn from them.
Thank you. Sarah, what gives you hope?
I mean, there's so much cause for hope. I mean, first of all, so many people are risking their lives, and they continue to do this despite the odds against them. You know, Myanmar, Mike just mentioned. If you look even at the anti-war protests that are happening right now in Russia, and this is a context where going against the government is bringing great personal risk to yourself, and not only are people continuing to go into the streets, but they are finding creative ways to do it where they will be able to speak their minds and hopefully continue to express themselves in such a repressive environment. Another point that I'll make is push back against the Chinese Communist Party, that we see both at home inside China and around the world. You know, it was not that long ago that we were saying, wow, there's just so much expansion of CCP influence in other countries, and it's gotten so repressive at home. How could this change? But there's actually a lot more civic movement within China than gets talked about. That's not the CCP's preferred narrative. But there are protests in that country. There are people who are speaking out. And in terms of influence in other countries, we are seeing media groups who are refusing to cooperate with the Chinese state narrative. We have the example of the Women's Tennis Association supporting Peng Shuai when she was making accusations against a senior official of sexual harassment. And that's, you know, of course, against their business interests and the great money that comes into sporting events through China. We are the kind of awareness that we are trying to raise through presentations like this and through communicating with all of you is what is necessary to sort of spread further, that people realize that actually quite a lot can be done and that it is being done. And it is more a matter of providing these people with support and with doing what we can in our own individual lives, and seeing that democracy is the best method. It can have flaws, but it can learn from those flaws and improve. And that if we all have our basic rights and freedoms, we will all be more secure, we'll be economically more prosperous, and the world will be a better place.
Thank you, Sarah, for that excellent defense of democracy. I really appreciate it. And I thank you and Amy for a very good presentation, as always. I want to thank the whole group of you who joined us today. We had great questions. I apologize that we were unable to get to all of the questions, but we will look for other opportunities to interact with the public over the next several months. And thank you all for joining us today. I think, Lara, with that, we're closed. And any other housekeeping?
Yeah, just a couple housekeeping things. There were a few questions, that were more particular to countries, and I just want to let you guys know that the full report can be found on our website at freedomhouse.org or freedomintheworld.org. Either one will direct you to the same reports. And there are country reports that offer some narratives and some perspectives around these scores. So some of you all were really interested in having a little bit more context around those. And so I would just encourage you to check out the full country reports online. And also I would flag that we will be adding a few more countries in the weeks to come. There are a handful that we are still updating. So those will be updated, as well as perspectives. There were a handful of you that were really trying to put this in context on the broader world stage. And so I would just flag for you that we will be publishing perspectives that are pulled from this, in the weeks ahead too. So follow us on our newsletter, follow us on Twitter, check us out on Facebook. And I, again, look very much forward to working with you all.
Thank you, everybody. We're done.